is zone 2 training actually better than high intensity training when it comes to cardiac adaptations? That's what we're going to try and untangle in this video. And to understand what's going on at the heart level, first we're going to look at the other endurance adaptations that we see across the body that help the heart. That will help us understand what's going on in the heart itself. And then maybe we'll be able to answer the question, which type of training is better when it comes to getting a stronger, bigger heart that can help us pump more blood and ultimately move more oxygen across the body and perform better, whether it's in an endurance sport or not. So when it comes to adaptations in the body from endurance training that help the heart, there's going to be a couple that are the most important in my opinion, 3 actually that come to mind. The first one is going to be an increase in capillary density. So the capillaries are the microvessels around the muscle fibers, and this is where the exchange of oxygen happens between the blood and the muscle fiber itself. So you can think of it as the parking spaces at the airport for the cabs that come and drop off passengers about to take their plane. And obviously in that context, the airport is the muscle fiber, the taxi is hemoglobin inside your red blood cells, and oxygen is the passenger inside the taxi cab. So what happens is with endurance training, there's an increase in blood flow, and it seems like that blood flow kind of digs up more of those capillaries, a little bit like if you were to drop a water hose in your garden. First it would make a puddle, and imagine you have a slight slope in your garden. Eventually it would kind of dig a network, almost like a river, right, down into the grass. And this is, from what I understand, this is what happens. It's kind of the constant pressure of endurance training that will help kind of dig those capillaries, and more capillaries, more surface of exchange. Remember, more parking spots for the taxi cabs to drop off their passengers. And so we can actually pass more oxygen from the blood into the muscle fiber thanks to that adaptation. And this is going to result in actually a lower heart rate, even without changing the heart at all, because you actually need less blood to do the same amount of work because you're extracting more oxygen per unit of blood. So that's one adaptation that is really important. Another adaptation that comes from endurance training in general, and that does help the heart, is an increase in blood volume. And usually I think it's mainly driven through plasma volume increase. And so plasma is one of the, let's say, components of the blood. And why is it better for the heart? Well, because essentially you can imagine it as putting more pressure in the system, and with a more pressurized system, and I'm putting air quotes here because it's not actually exactly what's going on, but just conceptualize it. All models are wrong, some are useful. I think this one is useful to understand what's going on. So you have more pressure in the system, and that actually increases venous return, so the blood that comes back from the muscles back into the right ventricle of the heart, and that preload actually helps better contract the heart in turn and eject more blood. So the more blood you have coming back to the heart, the more blood you can pump out. That's essentially it. In addition to the fact that the more you fill up your ventricle, the harder it's going to contract. So there's kind of that stretch reflex. I believe that's actually the mechanism that's going on. A little bit like at the bottom of a squat. If you keep that momentum, you'll be able to kind of bounce out a little bit better than if you do a pause, or if you go much slower on a 3 or 4 second eccentric tempo, for example. So that is the second adaptation that actually helps the heart, because with that increased pre-filling, then we can pump more blood with the same heart, even if the heart hadn't changed at all. The third adaptation is, and that one would be mainly driven by low intensity training, is an increase in parasympathetic tone. So we have sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system, and they're always active. Both of them are active, and at rest you actually have what's called the vagal brake. So the parasympathetic system that's kind of dampening or braking or kind of stopping the sympathetic drive from expressing itself. And as you increase exercise intensity, you get the kind of parasympathetic withdrawal, and that sympathetic system that can now express itself increase vascular tone, increase sympathetic tone, and kind of drive heart rate up and make sure your body is kind of ready for, and there's everything that goes on the hormonal side as well, that is kind of centrally driven by that nervous system component. And so by doing a lot of low intensity training, you will see a higher parasympathetic tone. That's actually one of the main reasons why resting heart rate goes down, and especially in long duration sports. So you look at marathon runners, triathletes, or ultra trail runners, you'll see very high resting heart rates. So obviously they have a big heart, and they're very well developed on the endurance side, but they also have a very, if we want to call it, developed parasympathetic branch, or a very active parasympathetic branch that comes and kind of dampens the sympathetic tone, and that is one of the things that is going to lower heart rate at rest and during exercise to some extent, from what I understand. So those are the three kind of main adaptations that I can think of off the top of my head that would influence the heart indirectly or directly. Now, what happens at the heart level itself when it comes to endurance training in general? I'm not talking about low or high intensity here yet. So what we usually see is going to be an increase in ventricular size. So the left ventricle, the one that pushes the blood back into circulation to your vital organs, to your brain, and to your muscles, that one's going to actually grow in size. And we call that eccentric hypertrophy, because it's the kind of inner cavity that's going to become bigger. You can kind of think about it as stretching of the heart, a stretching of that left ventricle. So more space inside that ventricle means you can have more blood in there. More blood in there means you can pump it and push more blood with each beat. Along with that increase in ventricular size, you also have an increase in contractility. So the strength with which your heart contracts and pushes blood. Those two things will influence stroke volume. You also have an increase in myocardial efficiency, meaning that your heart is not going to use up as much oxygen to function. So like any muscle that you train, it becomes more efficient. And it likely has to do with the same things I talked about before, increase in capillary density and all those cool things that happen. And those are going to be some of the major direct cardiac adaptations. So a bigger heart, a heart that contracts harder and better, and that increased efficiency of the heart itself. Now, coming to the question of whether low or high intensity is better for cardiac development, I don't know if we're able to answer that at this point in time. The problem being that cardiac adaptations take months and even years to take place, and you would have to train only with one modality, or either low or high intensity, for months, if not years, to then be able to pick apart whether one has more effect on the heart or the other has more effect on the heart. And I don't think we're currently able to do that. I also don't think it's sustainable to imagine we're going to train at high intensity for 2 years only and not any low intensity, because otherwise obviously we can't control for those two different types of training. So I don't believe we can currently study this. I looked around and I couldn't find any information pertaining to that directly. At this point, my understanding is that all training will help the heart, and it's kind of the global training volume that will have the positive impact on those adaptations that we talked about, whether it's the heart itself or the high intensity. Now, what I would say though is that obviously, and that's what I talked about, if not in, I talked about this in the video from yesterday. The high intensity training has a higher cost on the body in general compared to low intensity training. So technically, if we equate load in that context being, if we take the Foster model, so you take the difficulty of the session between 1 and 10, RPE scale 1 to 10, multiplied by the minutes of the session, and you have an arbitrary unit load for the session. If you equate those, well, obviously low intensity session, you'll be able to do more volume for the same total load. So that is one upside from the low intensity training side. You can do more of it for the same total load imparted on the body. But I don't necessarily think that we need to look for which one is better per se, because there's not really any training plan where we're going to want to, unless your name is Niels van der Poel. And for those that get the reference or don't get the reference, go check out my other video on that I made a while back. If you can't find it, text me in the comments and I will make a new one. Unless you're Niels van der Poel, you're not going to train one way for a year or even 2 years, not even 6 months, right? We want varied stimuli, and we want a nice balanced training plan. We want to do low intensity as our base for endurance training, but we also want to do medium intensity certain times of the year, high intensity certain times of the year, sprint interval training or sprint training some other times of the year, and that kind of global training approach will give us the best results. And if it's maintained over years, this is what will give us the best results and best cardiac adaptations. Thanks for your questions in the comments. Make sure you leave me more comments and more questions. I will make more videos, and I'll talk to you in the next one.